Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Conor Sheedy, and I'll be presenting today's Southern Talks on the topic of geopolitics, counterinsurgency, and intelligence flaws in the Sahel. On behalf of General Kulic and all of the staff here at the NATO Strategic Direction South Hub, or just the Hub as we call it, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you all and thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation. Today is the 15th of our Hub's Southern Talks. If you have not seen our previous talks, you can find them easily on our YouTube channel at ampersand or at NSD-S-Hub. And please feel free to subscribe and watch previous events and join us again in the future for future Southern Talks. And so to today's event. We are honored and delighted to have Dr. Ebimboere Seiyefa with us today. I will be calling you Ebi from now on, if that's all right. Thank you. Dr. Seiyefa provided us with an excellent presentation and discussion on the nexus between violent extremism and climate just over a year ago. And so we are very happy to have you back with us today. Dr. Ebimboere, if I can give you some background, is a lecturer in Baze University and acting head of the Department of International Relations and Diplomacy. She is the author of Why Organized Violence Thrives in Nigeria, The Problem of Elite Political Culture. Ebi holds a PhD in International Relations and Social Studies from Coventry University. She was the head of research in Conflict Research Network West Africa and is an advisory board member in Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Protection Project, otherwise known as ACLED. Ebi has worked with International Alert and United States Institute of Peace, amongst other institutions, to advance human security initiatives and programs to contribute to a peaceful West Africa. Her recent projects and publications include Geopolitics and Countering Violent Extremism in West Africa, published in the Africa Economic Development Journal, a chapter in the book Whispers of Discord, Intelligence Flaws and Counterinsurgency in the Sahel, Charting New Frontiers, published by Routledge. With that, let us begin. Ebi, would you like to briefly outline what you will be discussing with us today?
Thank you very much, Conor. And it is truly a privilege to share my thoughts with you today. So for today, I'll be briefly discussing on geopolitics, counterinsurgency, and violent extremism in the Sahel, but I'll be focusing on the western part of the Sahel region. I intend to explore briefly on the current manifestations of violent extremism in the Sahel region, looking at the perpetrators as well as the collective regional responses to the phenomenon of violent extremism in that region. I would also like to explore some identified selected intelligence flaws, which I believe is relevant to the conversation in terms of why we have not been able to effectively resolve the issue of terrorism and other forms of violent extremism in the region. In addition to that, I would also want to talk briefly on the geopolitical trends that we see occurring in our region, and then linking those trends to the issue of violent extremism in the region. So that in a summary is what I'll be talking to you about today.
Thank you very much indeed. And I have no questions to begin with. So if you would like, let's begin.
All right, so thank you very much. So I would like to start by, painting or rather giving you a background of violent extremism in the Sahel region. The Sahel region, ever since the period of 1960s, and that was the decolonization period, has had a series of different form of violent manifestation in the region, but we haven't actually we didn't actually have the problem of terrorism in the region. That is much more recent. And scholarship has traced that to the occurrence or what happened in Libya at the end of, during the fall of Gaddafi in the early 2000s, or will I say mid 2000s. So that is one aspect of the conversation. But in the Sahel region, we have had to deal with issues of bad governance, issues of climate change condition, issues of transnational organized crime. And these are also relevant issues. But more recently, we have been dealing with violent extremism, and we have had different actors who have been involved. I mean, we've had the GNIM, but before I mention the actors, I just want to classify the current manifestation of violent extremism in the region into three categories. And the first category is what we call the religious terrorism, or will I say religious fundamentalism, extremism, sorry, that we have in that region. And so we have groups like the GNIM, the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, we have the Islamic states in West African province, Al-Qaeda, as well as Boko Haram. So these are representative of a large network or groups of violent extremist groups in the region who are trying to promote a certain religious ideology and using terrorism as a tool to push that narrative out there. The second manifestation I would like to point out is the one that has to do with ethnic and separatism. And we see that in different forms. We see it in Mali, we see it in Burkina Faso as well. And if we recall, in 2012, when we had that military coup in Mali, we also had a separatist movement, which was the National Movement for Liberation of Azawad, and other groups as well. And so what these groups do is that they are looking to secede, or they are looking to push ethno-nationalist views, and also utilizing violence to achieve that goal as well. And then the last manifestation, which has not been really explored, which used to be a major issue, is the issue of transnational organized violent groups. But what we see, what is really different about this form of violent extremism, is that they are now utilizing extreme violence as a means to promote their objectives. And we also see collaboration between these transnational organized groups with terror organizations. For instance, when we reflect on the rise of Boko Haram in Nigeria and other parts of Niger, Chad, as well as Cameroon, we see that Boko Haram fell into the first category, religious extremism, and then decided to adopt criminal activities as a means of bankrolling its activities. But more importantly, we see a breakout of what we in Nigeria call the terror bandits. So these are groups of people who kidnap and also steal cattle. But this time around, there's a different dynamic. They use violent extremism as a way to push this narrative. So these are the three major manifestations of these violent groups that we have in the Western Sahel. Categories I meant, not manifestations. And so we now look at the other aspects in terms of still talking about the manifestation. We also look at the response, because in every region, and Sahel is not different, or West Africa is not different, you definitely would have a response to these manifestations of extremism. And so we have different actors who have over time been involved in trying as much as possible to deal with this issue. Again, another category I will categorize them into two. So we have the non-states and then the state actors. So for the non-state actors, you have at the subnational levels in each of these states, you have community leaders who are looking at ways of negotiation and diplomacy to resolve the issue. You also have vigilante groups who have lost confidence in the national armies as well as enforcement agencies in responding to this issue. So whether you have your hunters association, so this is what we see there as well. And in terms of also non-state, we also have the incursion, or rather the invitation of private military companies. So for instance, we have had groups like Russia's Wagner, now known as Africa Corps, Black Bear Brigade, and some other, will I call it black ops that happens there. And so we have, in terms of non-state, so they come in there with the objective to effectively respond to this group violent non-state actors. Now, for the state actors, definitely you have your national government or your national armies, but the one that is really instrumental to these conversations is the collective or the multilateral organizations that we have there. We have the Multinational Joint Task Force, which is comprised of Niger, Chad, Nigeria, and Cameroon. You also have the now defunct G5, where you have Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Mauritania, and Chad as well. And of course, you now have the newly minted AES states, which we would talk about when we get to the conversation of geopolitics. And definitely you also have other non-African nationals like the EU being led by France and of course United Nations. So these are the different multilateral groupings that we have who have been quite active in dealing with the issue of violent extremism. But they've not been very much effective. And that brings me to the next discussion. But before I, get into the conversation of the ineffectiveness from the perspective of intelligence flaws, I would ask if maybe there are any questions you need from me, Connor. Then I would continue with my presentation.
For the moment, I very much appreciate that brief introduction. I don't have any questions as yet. No, I think I'm very keen to hear your full explanation of what the flaws are in the approaches to these problems. I think all of us will be very keen to know what people living in the region and especially the public reaction to what is happening at the moment. So I'm looking forward to hear that. Thank you.
All right. So so we have these different actors. We have these different multilateral actors who are in the region, for the sole objective or the sole goal, ostensibly, of dealing with violent extremism or bringing an end to violent extremism in the region. And they've been there for quite some time. Whether you're talking about France, whether you're talking about the national armies, they've been there, but the issue of violent extremism still prevails. Now, when you look at different scholarship, you listen to the different conversations by state actors in terms of governments and of course, military officials as well. There is always this narrative of the reason why we're unable to effectively deal with this issue stems from governance, stems from corruption, stems from interference by foreign nationals, etc. So these are crucial reasons. And I would not in any way undermine those reasons. I mean, they are quite valid in their own. But for my research, one of the things I think about in my research is that I think about the issue of intelligence flaws, and that has not been extensively explored. So we talk about the kinetic aspect of it in terms of, or rather, scholars criticize the state's preference for military intervention. But the reality is that you are dealing with non-state armed actors. You need to, engage with them. And so you need to get your soldiers in the battlefield to effectively engage with them. So I decided to explore the issue of intelligence flaws, and I identified three flaws. And these three flaws, the first one I want to talk about briefly is the flaw of the Sahelian government and its allies underestimating the resilience and intensity of violent extremist groups in the region. And I think this stems from the recorded reports of victories, the multinational joint task force, France's diverse Operation Serval, Operation Bouquet, all of them. So you read about the reports of victories, territories being recaptured by these groups. And then when you read those reports also emphasized by national governments in newspaper headlines. It creates this false sense of we have ended violent extremism. And to a certain degree, when you reflect on what we have seen in Mali, in some parts of Nigeria, as well as Niger, there seem to be some recorded reports of a decline in violent extremist groups. But then again, this is where intelligence is very, very crucial. Is it crucial because these groups, multinational organizations or France or US now shut down drone base in Agadez, in Niger, as emphasized on signal intelligence and image intelligence. Very, very important in the war against violent extremism. But there is the exclusion of human intelligence. So when you are not listening, or rather when you are not getting intel from the ground, or rather from individuals who are actively engaging with this group, you tend to lose sight of the structural issues that has led to the sustenance of this group. For instance, it is very easy to lump all these religious extremist groups in one, in one box and say, oh, they do have the same goal. And then you think they have the same ideologies. But no, Boko Haram is different from Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb, which is different from ISWAP. And while it seems on the surface that they have the same goals, their ideologies are quite different as well as their methods. In most cases, they do compete with each other for they compete with each other for international recognition, but at the same time, too, they also collaborate. And this is where human intelligence comes into play, which has been ignored. And because of that, we have undermined the determination of these groups to continue to wage war against states, against the states to achieve its goal. And this is part of it, in terms of that undermining. And that is why we have seen a sustained engagement by these violent extremist groups with the state actors that we have there. The second intelligence flaw I want to briefly touch on is the issue of invitation of private military companies by the Sahel governments inviting them to deal with the problem of violent extremist groups in the region. Now, I would concede that PMCs have proven effective. When you look at our case study in Central African Republic, they seem to have completely dealt with the issue of violent extremism in that region, the rebels there. And so you have limited reports of active engagement, but there is negative piece there. The issues are still there. And again, with private military companies, they are well equipped, they are well funded, they are better trained and better compensated. And more importantly, when national armies are concerned, they are able to operate within a framework that is not constrained by international rules of engagement or international laws. And so, in effect, from a pragmatic point of view, not to ignore the importance of human rights protection, they're able to effectively deal with these groups and instill fear as a form of deterrence, for other non-state actors who are thinking of using terror activities. So in that regard, they could be seen as somewhat effective. But then again, another role that human intelligence plays, which has been ignored, is what are the national armies saying about this? When you reflect on what we have seen in Mali, for instance, Mali is actually a good case study that we can use. We can see that the national army do have some certain resentment where the private military companies are concerned. Apart from the fact that they are better paid, they also believe that the government gives much more priority to these groups at the expense of them who are actually engaging with this group. And that has led to a little bit of conflicts or will I say, a little bit of conflict, not really armed conflict, but conflict in terms of national armies, fighting alongside private military companies to interact, or rather to respond to this violent extremist group. So that is very, very important. Another aspect is also the possibility of intelligence leak. They have been, allegedly, I've not been able to collaborate these views, but there is some form of merit that private security companies, in the case of Wagner, are known not just, being there to deal with the problem of extremist group, but also to collect intel or data that might be of interest to Russia in its interaction with these countries there in terms of national interest. And so what happens, you can't necessarily control, because these private military companies have to work alongside with national armies, so which means that they are privy to certain military and defense strategy that ordinarily you wouldn't want, foreigners to have access to. So how do you control the utilization of such information is very, very important. And let's not also forget that in the case of Wagner, we have seen agreements whereby state governments in the Sahel have agreed that in exchange for your military services, we would give you some form of access to our solid mineral resources. Host communities are not happy with that particular agreement. And when you reflect on the root causes of insecurity, or the reasons why young men would agree to join this group or to be recruited into this group, you realize that part of it has to do with limited access to public services or, perception of marginalization. And so when host communities see foreigners having access to solid minerals, which they believe should be theirs, it leads to conflict again, the same issue that we are talking about. And then one more point under the private military companies that are there. When the military juntas took over power in Niger, Chad, Mali, and Niger, and of course Burkina Faso, one of the rallying cry was nationalism. They argued that Western powers, in this case France, are interfering and they have no form of control. And so you have pushed out France and you have invited Russia, in this case Wagner, into into your country, and you've given them access to your solid minerals. And so most citizens of those countries, in particular Mali, And more recently, Niger and Burkina Faso are beginning to question, are we exchanging one for the other? Why should they have access to our resources? So these are some of the issues that we have ignored in terms of listening to human intelligence. And then the third one I want to highlight is failure to optimize national or local intelligence sources. And I just want to highlight one critical issue before I look at the two aspects of it, is that in as much as we have faith in technology and we have faith in technology and what is the word I'm looking for? Sorry about technology and firepower. These are quite useful in effective engagement with enemies. But what is really crucial is the national army ability to adapt to these changes, in counterinsurgency operations. And this is where intelligence comes in. How are we able to adapt to these changes if we have this information? And that is very, very crucial, really important.
Yeah. Might I ask you a question there?
All right.
So I think it's extremely interesting you bringing up this entire domain and demonstrating just how complex it is and how many actors there are. I think the greatest mistake is to try and focus on just one facet of it at a time, almost to the exclusion of others, which may lead to what seem like clearer answers, but in the end become a lot less useful, because without looking at the entire context, it's information in a vacuum at times. And if I could just therefore ask you about one of the things you mentioned, which I find very interesting, is the use of private military companies, for example, Africa Corps, previously Wagner, in relation to collecting data and also the access to minerals. From my perspective, or from our perspective, I'd be very interested in knowing, which do you think is their genuine priority? I mean, are they there primarily as support to try and resolve the issues of counterinsurgency, or to assist counterinsurgency against violent extremism? Or is the purpose more directly gathering data and enriching themselves?
So I want to say it's a combination of both, but when any country, in this case Russia, any country decides to intervene, it's not usually for it's not solely humanitarian or altruistic. There's always the national interest there. And so for Russia, it could be twofold or it could be more than that. So, but more importantly for Russia, since its war with Ukraine has happened, it has had bad press, lots of sanctions, and it hasn't really been faring well at the international community. But Russia sees an opportunity in Africa to project some form of diplomatic strength to also get more allies. And so, the issue of violent extremism has been quite there, and it realizes, it was able to capture this good opportunity. The people were beginning to get, fed up with the authorities whom they have given legitimacy to wage war against the violent extremists on their behalf. And so Russia sees a very good opportunity to get into that space. Don't forget that Russia was also in Syria for similar, reasons, ostensibly. Yes, to also project power while also helping the Syrian government. It was also in other part of Eastern Europe doing something similar as well. And now they are now in Africa. So they are trying to project a diplomatic image while at the same time also trying to get access to much needed solid minerals as well. So it's kind of twofold. It's a win-win situation for them, really,
Right.
for the Americans.
And in your own opinion, which of the foreign actors, whether they be individual countries or PMCs or whatever else, are considered, you mentioned the adjective altruistic, which are seen by the local populations as being more altruistic than others, are being most on their side? I'm not saying which are most on their side, but
Yeah.
the perspective of the people living there, who are perhaps innocent, not involved in any of the terrorist activities or even the counter-terrorist activities.
I think at this particular point, because I've also been having these conversations with people from, different walks of life and different countries across the Sahel region, as well as at the grassroots level. And I think West Africans are actually much more pragmatic. So they are very, very much aware that none of these powers, whether Western or Eastern China, Russia, none of them are actually there for purely, good reasons. They are also there to pursue their national interest. But then again, they are also forced to reflect in the last decade or 2 decades or so. And so their argument is that we've had France, we have had the UK, we have had the United States, we have had the United Nations in our communities or in our countries for this period of time. And we haven't necessarily gotten, 100% what we want. And there's a very important caveat I want to, highlight here is the issue of propaganda. Now, I am not pointing fingers, but I do know that our national government in West African states, they do have this culture of painting the picture, especially Francophone countries, of painting the picture that everything that is wrong with our region is tied to our to our colonial history or tied to neo-colonialism or imperialism. And so people are encouraged to blame France in the case of Francophone countries for everything that is wrong with their country, forgetting that you also have political leaders who have a responsibility to provide good governance. On the other side, having these new people in Russia and China, increased engagement because they've always been there, of Russia and China. There is a little bit of healthy suspicion from China's perspective. China simply giving us all this amount of money in terms of loan. And not to, deviate a little bit from the conversation, but when you have China giving you huge amounts of money, it is difficult for you to speak up, especially when you think of the maritime security, maritime security in terms of overfishing and, the rest of green crime that actually happened there. So you can't really speak out because you are collecting so much money from them. And West Africans are aware of that trap. For Russia, there is this happiness that, okay, so Russia is on ground with what we've seen in Central African Republic, and they have been able to do what, other countries have not done in terms of a ceasefire, if I can use the word ceasefire, because I know that these groups are still very much there. And it's a matter of time if the critical issues or the structural issues that led to their emergence are not dealt with, they will definitely come back. So, so there is a lot of suspicion, there's a lot of watching, but on the overall, at least from those of us from the academic community, for us, this is an opportunity for us to leverage our agency. So for now, we're like at the risk of going all using some cultural terms. We're like the African bride with so many suitors coming, and so now we are at the table. We have a seat at the table, so it's left for us to leverage. So there is a healthy suspicion, but it's more of we have dealt with one group of people, we didn't really get what we have, and this is actually my own voice speaking at this particular moment. I do have concerns. I'm very much aware that the Western world were engaging with West African countries within, or they were constrained by international laws, human rights, and those kind of laws. And so that limits the amount of, I don't want to use the word damage, or that limits the amount of activity they could do in the country with causing minimal damage. But countries like China and Russia are not constrained by these liberalist views or democratic views of human rights or democracy, or this incentive that would have been used to leverage African leaders to make right decisions for its citizens. And that is quite concerning, because when the US or the UK gives you money, it comes with strings. You have to, ensure good governance, human rights protection. African leaders are strongly encouraged. But when China and Russia gives you money, it doesn't come with those strings. And so these are some of the critical issues these are the conversations that we have been having in our region, but we choose to see it as an opportunity for greater agency. And, so I hope I've been able to explore that question.
Yes, absolutely. And just right at the end of that question, Western conditions, the rules-based order. In your opinion, have recent events in the Western world where the rules-based order has certainly been thrown into question much more dangerously, particularly in relation to some of the larger countries in the world?
Absolutely.
Is this coming across as hypocritical?
Absolutely. I mean, we've been having this conversation. I mean, here we are sitting down watching the United States, the leader of the free world, the defender of human rights and liberal thoughts, making these very interesting policies or decisions. And we are wondering what exactly is going on and what does that mean, for us in West Africa in terms of promoting these liberal thoughts. So it's quite interesting. We haven't, used the word hypocritical yet, but I'm pretty much sure we're getting there. For now, we are puzzled or baffled, and then we are wondering that where are the strong institutions? Because we are being told by the Western world, and we agree with that perspective as well, that one of our problems is weak institutions and strong leaders. So we're aware of that, and we're beginning to see something similar because we recognize these tactics that Donald Trump is, we're like, okay, this is quite familiar. We see this in our countries. We know about things like this, making laws that are not, making pronouncement or decrees, if I dare use the word decrees, that are not in line with constitution. And we are wondering what is going on. And so so for some that are really, really concerned, the argument is that if he should succeed in building that, in undermining the institutions which are supposed to be strong, what message is it sending to African leaders who are quite in the habit of ignoring these institutions? So these
Right.
are cause of concerns.
And
Yeah.
do you think that this is also adding to the attractiveness, particularly at the present, of unconditional support by China and to a lesser extent Russia, and that the local populations, but not only the local populations, also the leaders and the military are now, are they swinging more towards that, or is the balance just always
Well, African states, we do have a foreign policy of being neutral. We try not to take side with any of these big powers. I mean, Cold War, we saw what happened there. So we tend to be very, very neutral. But we also admit that the actions taken by the US administration currently now do have some form of ripple effects. Like Donald Trump is like a transactional president, if for lack of a better term to use. And so we see that that relationship between Europe and the United States is now transactional, which has not always been the case, whereby when it comes to defense and security, there's some form of leaning towards the United States for support. And so Europe is now looking inward, is now becoming more region-centric, and all those lovely money or aid and support that African states have always gotten, in this case, West Africa from Europe, we are not going to have that much access to it as much as before again. So that means that we need to look for somebody else who is willing to give us what we are looking for at this particular case. Now, I'm not saying that we should be beggarly. I would rather we figure out a way of, building our defense without necessarily leaning on other countries. But Russia and China are there with arms open wide, willing to give us this support, which we might not have access to due to these policies and the ripple effects. So this is part of it. But African leaders would always be neutral. Well, maybe the AES states are not neutral, but we have a foreign policy of neutrality. We tend not to rock the boat so much.
right, right. And do you think that the best approach, and this again is your opinion, but the best approach to counteract the international confusion about what exactly the rules-based order is at the moment, do you think the best approach is to focus as much as possible on African agency, and if at all possible for African nations to seize this opportunity of discord in the rest of the world and increase their unity amongst themselves? Is that, or is that just an ideological question on my part?
That is the best option. And I recall that was it 3 weeks ago or so, I was in Accra for a conversation that is similar to this in terms of the AES issue. We're talking about the AES question. And, at the end of the day, we came to a clear conclusion, and we are hoping that ECOWAS member states, because we did a communique to them, we're hoping that they would take this under advisement, because we also had the ambassador for, or the commissioner for the political and the peace and security aspect of ECOWAS. He was in that meeting. And we told him that one of the glaring issues that we have is that West African states do not have a set, clear national interest or national security interest. And that is part of the problem. Identify our national interest, and then that would be a form of leverage when we have to have these conversations, both at the regional level and also with these actors who are coming in with with Russia and China. And so, yes, I completely agree with you. I don't think it's an idealistic question. I think is the reality that we are dealing with right now. We have to define our interests and then take that to the table, because we have a lot of actors who are coming in, and not just Russia and China. We have Turkey, who is now getting well vested, looking to sell weapons to African, I mean mainly to the Sahel states in waging this war against violent extremism. We have Saudi Arabia, which we have to be very careful with, because I mean, you know, Saudi Arabia and Iranian proxy war that is going on over there in Yemen. So we have all these actors coming in, and so we need to clearly define our national interests and ensure that when we have these conversations of treaties or agreements with them, we are able to put, you know, West Africa first or Africa first in that region.
And have the over the last few years, obviously the now defunct G5 Sahel, the development of the Alliance of Sahel States, the AES, many coups, much unrest at a political level, probably is the best way of putting it. Is that causing great difficulty in trying to identify these Western African interests, defining them and taking them to the table? I would see it as being extremely difficult to have one voice coming out of very many countries which have largely similar interests, but also quite big differences in interests at the same time.
Absolutely, absolutely. The AES states is, you know, it's more of a recent manifestation of some of the problems that we're having within the ECOWAS regional bloc. Now, ECOWAS always puts up this public image of unity, and yes, to a certain degree, in terms of economic integration, it is quite united. But when you really look into the bloc, there are cracks in it. You know, the question of a common currency, it's something we've been having this conversation since 1975 when ECOWAS was established. We cannot come up with a common currency. And it's largely due to the different interests of both Francophone and Anglophone West African country. And this has been made worsened by the breakout of the AES states. And so having that united voice, it's quite difficult, especially when you are dealing with powers that are beyond the West African region. But ECOWAS has been looking to rebuild that relationship. And so the consequences of the AES leaving has not been felt by the AES state, because ECOWAS is still looking for a way to bring them back in. For instance, the free movement of goods and services, AES member states are still free to come into West African states and also trade with us. So that has not been taken away. And there have been a lot of bilateral and multilateral treaties between these three countries and ECOWAS states. So managing that in terms of having a united voice in West Africa, dealing with other countries is quite difficult. It is really complex and difficult. And I know that the Nigerian state, who is seen as the leader or the hegemon power in West Africa, has been trying as much as possible to balance that you know, these differences, especially when we're talking about interactions with France, with Russia, China, and the United Kingdom. So these are issues. The conversations are still ongoing. And I know that when we celebrated our 50 years of ECOWAS, that was, you know, one of the issues on the table. How do we still maintain a united region in, you know, in terms of greater agency or in terms of interaction with powers beyond borders? But for now, the channels of communication, mediation, and dialogue are still being opened between the AES states and ECOWAS. And so there is that belief system that when power is being transitioned, because I mean, they said 5 years, or rather it's now 4 years. It's now 4 years. If you are counting the years left, they are going to transfer power back to civilian rule. So there is the belief that if that is done, then we can reintegrate these countries back. I don't know if that is possible. But, you know, as long as you have these nationalist views being promoted, advocated by the military juntas in these three states, it might be a bit difficult. But I know that the honeymoon period is over in Mali and, you know, in Niger. And as for Burkina Faso, we can't speak to that because most of the communication out of that country is being controlled by the government. So we're not exactly sure what is, I mean, the real situation on ground.
Right. Yes, I'm very interested to hear a little more about the honeymoon period being over. I fully understand the point you made there a moment ago about trying to organize a single currency. Europe found that almost impossible to do, and in fact, two of the major countries chose not to join when the euro came together, and we were an organization or an international organization where everybody was in agreement. It was peacetime. And yet it was still something that took many, many, many years and was extremely difficult to get across the line. So we can all understand how those very very positive and high objectives are difficult to achieve. Going back to the question that we're looking at now, what has led to the honeymoon period being over? Is it just impatience, or have things gone badly? Or is it that people have now realized that the entire approach to governance needs to be completely overhauled?
Yeah, it's a combination of all these factors that you've mentioned. I mean, when we look at Mali as a case study, because I mean, the news is out there. So we see that for the Malians, they've actually had a series of military civilian regime and, different administrations. Then when you go back as far back as 2012 with Boubacar Keïta, when he was kicked out or removed military coup, we see that the people have set expectations from their governments. They expect security, they expect economic prosperity. These are two critical issues that the Malians speak to. And for those in northern Mali, they expect to be included in national politics. So 3 of those critical issues. And so far, so good. None of the administration have been able to bring that in. So when we had the military coup, this current military coup, we saw the news and the news events, we saw videos of people celebrating, and I was just there, and I was thinking that be celebrating, it will soon be over. The reality will soon dawn on them. And initially, because these leaders, I mean, the head of military head of state came up with this propaganda that our problem is France. If we get rid of France, everything is going to be okay. That was a summary of his arguments. And the people realized that, okay, so France has left, but the issue of insecurity still prevails. And although for a short period of time, the military government seemingly had control over security, they were able to recapture some territories that these groups are taking. But as time went on, the groups, they regrouped, and we had attacks, especially outside of the capitals, outside of Bamako, in some parts of northern Mali. We're having attacks there, which was quite difficult for the Malian citizens to accept, because the whole idea of bringing you on board was to ensure security. In terms of economic prosperity, not so much as well. So what they expected has not been delivered by the military regime. But more importantly, people are also not allowed to express their views. I was able to speak with a few scholars that we met at a neutral ground, and we had a conference. And then I asked them, what exactly is going on in Mali? Are people happy? Is everything really rosy as we see on newspaper headlines? And the answer was no. The issues that the people had problems with: security, economic security, physical security, economic security, as well as inclusivity at the national level politics, have not been achieved by the military regime. And so, as far as they are concerned, it isn't working. We are impatient. We need you to go and then bring somebody else in. And more recently, freedom of speech. The basic freedom of speech has been taken away from them, and that's a freedom of expression, if you want to put it that way. And that in itself is part of it. Now, in the case of Burkina Faso, I have not been able to get verified or collaborated reports on that. I have been, talking to my contact there, but people are a bit leery to talk. And I think in itself, the fear of speaking in itself is evidence that things are not really working as they expect it to work. And so you have Ibrahim Touare making all these comments, talking about promoting a united Burkina Faso, whereby they have sovereignty, they have full political independence, economic independence. I mean, those are good goals. I mean, if he can achieve it, why not, if not? But my only fear is strong men, weak institution. What happens when, his tenure is over? We go back to square one. As for Niger, the same story too with Mali as well. The expectations has not been met. And so people are beginning to feel uncomfortable. And if at any time ECOWAS should decide to close down their borders, that will be a serious problem for those 3 countries. They are landlocked countries surrounded by, the other members of ECOWAS states who could decide to close down their borders. They don't have access to coastal waters or coastal West African countries to get their goods in. Morocco might tell them that, don't worry, I'm happy to help you, but at what cost? So the reality of leaving ECOWAS has not dawned. If ECOWAS were to make the decision to ensure that these countries do not have access to the benefit of being a member of ECOWAS, the citizens would actually revolt. these nationalist or populist views will not last long as the basics are not, adhered to. So those are my thoughts regarding that issue.
Your opinion is that if, for example, ECOWAS were to close the borders on the AAS states, would that just be the next step in instability, not necessarily caused this time by terrorists, but just internal fragmentation of states? And is there any chance that, although there would be a revolt by the local populations, that do you think that that would lead to anything getting better, or just another part in the link of problems?
Well, it will create more problems and maybe a solution if you look at it from another perspective, because thanks to ECOWAS free movement of goods and services, a lot of these border communities are dependent on each other. I mean, when you look at Nigeria's border with Niger, I have actually never been to the border, but this is based on interviews I've had with people who live in those communities, as well as looking at maps. So we see that these communities, they rely a lot on cross-border trade, which are not taxed in most cases. So you have a lot of communities depending on this cross-border trade to survive and to thrive, as well as the other benefit that comes with being a member of ECOWAS states. ECOWAS says that, you know what, since you're tied to leave and we've been trying to get you to come back in, we are going to shut down our borders. We'll not give you access to our airspace or our land borders or our water borders. This will definitely lead to intense economic stress on both the informal and the formal sectors in this country. Now, when citizens do not have access to basic needs or their pockets are empty, they would rise against whichever government, whether it's military, whether it's civilian. And that will lead to another level of unrest in the region. And ECOWAS member states are aware of this. And partly, that is the reason why, they have decided not to shut down the borders, because they are thinking about the welfare of West African citizens in those countries, as well as the security implication. Because if you have a dissatisfied or a discontented population, it will lead to unrest or insecurity. So they would revolt against the government, which will be expressed in riots and violence. The government will want to enforce its authority by bringing in, the police and the military. And I mean, you get the picture I'm trying to paint there. And
Yes.
that would also give these non-state armed actors, these terrorist groups, more leverage and more justification to recruit more members and continue the cycle of violence. So on the one hand, it might lead to the topple of this military government, new civilian government, bringing them back into ECOWAS and maybe some form of peace.
In terms of looking towards the future, do you think there's any possibility that that level of frustration among the local populations can lead to a constructive, I don't want to use the word democratic or rules-based, because that's a little bit of a gray area, but if you follow my meaning, is there any way that the large number of people revolting against the current situations could be done peacefully? Is there a possibility? Perhaps in which countries do you think that's more likely, and in which countries do you think it's less likely?
Well, for a question like this, I would like to reflect back to our military regime history in the different parts of West African states. We have seen that definitely the population does have a role to play in terms of expressing their discontent, either through protest, public letters, or getting the support of other democratic or civilian states within the region to persuade these military people to step down, or we can see another series of coup coming up. So that is it. Looking at Mali's history, it's more of a case of one coup after the other. You have a civilian regime. So for Mali, it is difficult to predict. I would like to think that, yes, there will be eventually in Mali, maybe in the next 3 or 4 years, a civilian government. The government doesn't carry out its expected responsibilities, a military coup will take place. That has been its own trajectory. So I have more faith in Mali, towing the line of civilian governance, but then again, it's all dependent on how they are able to provide. For Burkina Faso, I really can't see where it will land, because I know that Ibrahim Traoré has a very strong hold on the population. The propaganda is working seemingly well. Some scholars have actually alluded to support from Russia because Russia is quite good in active measures. I mean, they're very, very good in, promoting this propaganda and getting people on board. So as long as the population are seemingly blind or they decide to make a trade-off for democratic values for some form of security, then that would be the plight. As for Niger, Niger is the wild card. Its relationship with Nigeria, ideally should have, led to a change from military regime to democratic regime because Nigeria still has a very strong influence on Niger. Looking at our history, it has been quite supportive of the Niger economy as well as other forms of infrastructure. And in exchange for that support, I was expecting Nigeria to leverage that soft power diplomacy, to come up with some form of political agreement on how to change power from military to civilian. But I think we lost that window when ECOWAS, under the leadership of the Nigerian president, decided, came up with a sanction of military intervention. So we lost that particular window. So I can't really predict accurately what it will look like. But I do have confidence that within the 5-year period, we should see some form of change because the other governments in West Africa begin to realize that if they do not do the necessary, although apart from Ivory Coast is a different ball game. And I'm amazed that the current head of state is not sensitive to the happenings within his country. Elections are supposed to take place and we have him locking up opposition leader, which is a very, very bad move and creating that environment for a military coup to take place. But most African leaders are aware of, West African leaders, are aware of this and taking the necessary steps to ensure that a military coup does not happen. So a lot of uncertainty out there, but one of the major focus or the major goal of most West African state governments is to deal with the much more overt threats of violent extremism in the region, and that is why good governance tends to take a back seat, which unfortunately is quite sad because bad governance leads to the sustenance and the emergence of these groups. So these are the the realities that we are dealing with here.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Now, we're coming towards the end of our allotted time. Rather than me asking you a question which will probably limit the answers you might give, how would you like to close this discussion?
Okay, upon reflection, there are 3 things I would like to, briefly touch on. So I will still want to come back to the question of intelligence flaws. And I think for me, what I think that we should do at this particular stage is that we need to optimize local and national intelligence. So what this means is that there is a need to strengthen the intelligence structure and also strengthen counterintelligence structure, departments within our national intelligence agencies across the Sahel region. So while we try to leverage on what foreign bodies like Russia, well, France, if it ever comes back, and the US are willing to give in terms of SIG-int and image-int, we can also leverage on human intelligence and also strengthen our local national intelligence agencies. So that is the one thing I want to highlight briefly on. The second one I want to talk about is the issue of taking advantage of the current geopolitical trends that we see. We have other powers who are interested in West Africa for their different national interests, which is understandable and accepted as well. So I would like West African states and West African citizens as well to leverage on this interest and get the best that we can from these treaties or agreements. So that is that. And for the issue of the AES states and military regime, it's very important that West African citizens do not lose sight. They don't get caught up in the image that Ibrahim Traore is projecting, an image of of a nationalist or a populist leader, an image of a reborn Thomas Sankara. They shouldn't get caught up in that image of a hero coming to save the day. They should focus rather on building strong institutions. Military regime is not the answer to West Africans' problem. antagonizing Western powers or excluding Western powers in international relations or in our relations with these states is not the answer to our problems, but defining our national interest and putting our interests first when we sit or when we negotiate with these foreign bodies, be it Russia, China, France, the US, the UK, should be what we should focus on. I think these are largely my thoughts or my closing remarks this issue.
Thank you very much indeed, Ebby. I have to say this has been as much of a pleasure as I had hoped it would be. I thoroughly enjoy listening to you. I know you have a million other things that you could discuss and share with us. So I have no doubt, if you're willing, that we will do this again, perhaps in less than a year. And may I just say I wish you the very best for the rest of the week. And thank you very much again for all of your help.
Thank you very much for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.